name is Carolyn Gormley, and I'm going to be presenting for you today, Reforming the Noble Experiment. Pauline Sabin to speak for the Ladies' Aid Society of Wellsburg. Mrs. Sabin is the leader of the Women's Organization for National Prohibition Reform. Prohibition reform? That means the repeal of prohibition. What sort of society is that? I can't believe this. The Washingtonians, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the Anti-Saloon League. These are the great organizations of the temperance movement. In 1873, women began to openly plead and pray for prohibition, plead to a stop to the drunken husband, abused wife, and mistreated child. Where did all these evils come from? The saloon! Repeal prohibition and we'll be right back where we started from. Alcohol is a menace. When I think of how hard the WCTU fought and Anti-Saloon League fought, it horrifies me to think that the Wets would overturn all their hard work. Yet I do not think they will succeed. After all, the brewers and distillers tried to resist the tide of moral indignation, but they were no match for the onslaught of the forces of right. The Anti-Saloon League had every Protestant church except for the Lutherans and the Episcopalians on their membership, and together they ousted any man from public office who did not support their cause. The WTCU put out school material that raised a generation of abstainers. The Wets only worsened their case by trying to put each other down. Brewers like Augustus Busch said that whiskey was evil, but beer was liquid bread. Besides, the Great War turned people against German brewers, and anti-immigrant sentiment turned them against Irish distillers and saloon owners. Finally, in 1917, the 18th Amendment was introduced. In January 16, 1919, it was ratified, and on January 16, 1920, America was officially freed from the clutches of liquor. All that work and moral warfare, is this to come to nothing at the hands of some society matrons? For indeed, that is what the Women's Organization for National Prohibition Reform is working for. In fact, here I sit getting ready to go to a speech by the leader of their movement, a Mrs. Pauline Sabin, former establisher of the Women's National Republican Committee. She has some atrocious views. I've heard so much about it that I have a curious desire to go see her myself. In a newspaper article in the Wall Street Journal, she said, "It sounds well to speak of the poor man who used to spend his paycheck on beer, now taking his family to the movies, but it is not so." She also says, "Do you really think that anyone has ever not gotten whiskey because they wanted it just because of prohibition? I know it never has." She has the wrong handle on the issue. Just because the law is not being enforced does not make it a bad law. If people are breaking the law, then the answer is to put more into enforcing it, not repeal it. Repealing the prohibition law and part of the Constitution will entirely decimate any respect people have for that document. God, oh dear. Look at the time. I've worked myself into a lather and I haven't even heard what she has to say. And if I don't start now, I don't suppose I ever will. Dear ladies of Wellsburg, my name is Pauline Sabin, and I am here on behalf of the Women's Organization for National Prohibition Reform. I am also here on behalf of all those of you who, like myself, feel that prohibition is wrong, but have not yet expressed those feelings out loud. Let me tell you something about myself which I think will help you better understand what I am trying to say to you. I am a mother. I have 2 sons whom I love very dearly. Before prohibition was a law of the land, I supported it because I thought that it would help my sons and keep them from liquor. Alcohol can be a bad thing if mistreated, and I and many others thought that removing it would be a good thing. It did not take us long to become disillusioned. Not only is prohibition not enforced, but the very men who speak about enforcing it and appear to be adamantly dry have cocktails after their speeches. The prohibition law has divided our nation into 3 sections: wets, dries, and hypocrites. This kind of hypocrisy is no good influence on our sons and daughters. Before Prohibition was the law, women and mothers had little to fear from the saloon as far as their children were concerned. Now, in stills and speakeasies all over the country, you can find boys and girls in their teens drinking liquor. And this situation has become so acute that the mothers of America feel that something must be done to protect their children. It is now considered grown-up and sophisticated to flout the law. It is true that before Prohibition, there were many men who spent their entire paychecks on beer. But it is also true that now those same men are drinking the same amount of alcohol in stills and speakeasies for twice the price. I see no improvement in this. Mothers, your children are at stake here. Join me in repealing this influence of hypocrisy and law contempt from their lives. Mothers, if you feel that the law will keep your sons from alcohol, I ask you to think again. Is it truly the government's job to influence your sons for the better? No, most decidedly no. By Prohibition, we are endeavoring to force off on the government a job that is properly our own. Women. For years, the Women's Christian Temperance Union has told the world that it speaks for all the women of America. I am here today to tell you that that is no longer the case. Women all across America are awakening to the evils of Prohibition. I ask you now to awake with them and join our cause. The time has come to push for the repeal of Prohibition. We are no longer talking of temperance versus drink. We are speaking of whether temperance is a personal issue or not. And now, ladies, I ask you to think on what I have said. Years ago that was. 10 years ago I went to that speech of Mrs. Saban's and was completely won over to the wet cause. The things she said to us made sense. What she was telling us was right and proper. I joined the Women's Organization for National Prohibition Reform. I and many of my neighbors. The women of America got together and told our nation that Prohibition had run its course. The noble experiment had failed. It was time to move on. It wasn't just the women either. All across America, people were getting in on this. There were radio talks, aviator shows, parades, speeches. In 1932, President Roosevelt was elected on a repeal Prohibition platform, and in 1933, the 21st Amendment was passed, repealing the 18th Amendment. This was a huge reform. It was the first time any amendment had been passed for the express purpose of repealing another amendment. This was a good thing. Americans made a law, and the law was a bad law. But we stepped back and acknowledged that. We reformed the noble experiment.